Hi everyone. So we're going to go over chapter 10, which covers person, situation, and interactionist aspects of personality. In the 1920s, researchers did a number of experiments on school-age children, and they put them in a situation in which they had the opportunity to copy correct answers to an exam from an answer key. And the researchers wanted to see if students would actually cheat or if they wouldn't. And so they were measuring the students' degree of honesty. And results showed that some students cheated, but others did not cheat. And then they were given opportunities to find money that had been planted in a puzzle box by researchers. And they found the same thing. Some students kept the money, whereas others did not keep the money. So overall, an interesting result of this research is that students who appeared honest on some tasks appeared dishonest on others. And so the researchers could not find any evidence for a cheating personality because students were always behaving differently depending on what was going on in the situation. So the research showed that there's very few people that are always honest or always dishonest. And that's what they found in most of the studies, that it was very rare to find somebody that was always honest or that always did not cheat. But there were people that were not always dishonest either. Sometimes they would be honest. So most of the time, people were both, which means that there are inconsistencies in personality because a person does not always act the same in every situation, but they also don't always act different. And so one question that kept popping up is that how can we talk about personality if people are always inconsistent? And how can personality be measured if people keep changing their behavior? Well, Kurt Lewin, he proposed that behavior is clearly a function of both personal characteristics and the immediate social situation. And so he came up with the situation interactionist approach, in which behavior is a function of the person and the environment. And so the person situation interactionist perspective explains that people tend to express their personality in different ways and in different situations. And they attempt these situation interactionist theorists attempt explicitly to consider social situations and their influence on behavior. Sullivan came along and he proposed his theories in the 1940s, and his ideas are very relevant to the personality theories of today. And so he was investigating healthy or unhealthy psychological development in the reactions of one's peers. And most modern research confirms that social acceptance or rejection is a core element that's influencing individual behavior and personality. And so chumpship is known as the important role that's played by peers in the formation of somebody's identity. And psychosocial threats to a person's well-being are loneliness, isolation, and rejection. And all of these threats are inherently social because there is a situation or group that's doing the rejecting. And so a person can develop anxiety or unhealthy behaviors when they experience interpersonal rejection. It's a social influence that's impacting identity. Now, the importance of our peers and the interaction of the individual in close social environment can sometimes show itself in unusual ways. So there was a study that looked at metalheads, where individuals in the 1980s were dedicated fans of heavy metal music groups. And these fans of metalheads were involved in the music scene, but they had a lot of issues fitting into other groups and had a lot of challenges in school and were often seen as rebellious and unconventional. So some heavy metal music fans ended up abusing drugs, but the majority of them grew up to become well-adjusted, healthy adults. So the argument here is that because they participated in this fringe culture, it allowed them to develop an identity that was accepted by a group, hence not making them feel rejected. And so, all of that to say, personality is a pattern of interpersonal interactions. It's inextricably tied to social situations, and it's the relatively enduring pattern of this reoccurrent interpersonal situation that characterizes a person's life. And so, Sullivan's approach is therefore sometimes known as this interpersonal theory of psychiatry. Edward Sapir was another key influence on Sullivan, and he was an anthropologist, and he studied diverse societies, and he saw that behavior was heavily influenced by culture. And so Sullivan integrated the work of Sapir, and he concluded that enduring patterns of human relationships were shaped by family and society, which forms the essence of our personality. And he also believed that to understand personality, that we have to look for these reoccurring patterns of social relations in a real societal context. His views on personality were also not built around unconscious impulses of the id, and that our behaviors are not fixed in early childhood, and we're constantly changing as a function of relations with others. And so the id, as Freud mentioned, is, according to psychoanalytic theory, is an innate desire and impulse. But to Sullivan, the id is changing constantly because the environment is constantly changing and our relations with others are changing. And so it's really a function of being with others. Henry Murray was an American psychologist who developed the theory of human personality based on an individual's inborn needs and his relationship with the physical and social environment. And so he was the most influential precursor of the modern movement. And so he studied motivation and goals. And so his team used interviews and projective tests. They also created challenging, stressful situations in order to develop a deep knowledge of human motivation and sensitivity to social and situational demands to create this view of personality that has stimulated a lot of work. His inspirations were taken from unconscious motivations from Freud, Jung, and Adler, environmental pressures from Lewin, and sophisticated trait concept from Alport. Personology was a theory developed by Murray, and essentially it's a study of the person himself. Murray believed that no isolated piece of behavior could ever be understood without taking into account the fully functioning person. So he believed that personology is simple in structure, but it's complex in detail. And so he accepted unconscious fantasies and instinctual drives. His theory also emphasized social roles and situational determinants. He assumed and plotted creativity, and he looked at combination of internal motivations and external demands. And so he emphasized this environmental press, the push of the situation. And these are directional forces on a person that arise from other people or events in the environment. So, for example, seeing a person's friend and getting good grades in school might be a press spurring one's own efforts to excel, or taking that case of whether students will cheat. We might find that a high need to achieve in school might combine with a situation in which a lot can be gained by cheating at low risk or cost. And in this situation, cheating would more likely be the result. And so environmental press is really pushing the situation on behavior, and the behavior is driven by directional forces and arises from the people or events that are in that situation. TIMA was a term that Murray used to describe a typical combination of needs and presses that can be measured with a projective test known as the thematic apperception test. This is a test where a person is presented with a series of ambiguous pictures, also known as the ambiguous stimulus. And they are asked to then present a narrative or imaginary interpretation of what they see. And the idea is that their needs and desires, or any conflict that's going on in their life, is going to be projected onto this test based on what they see. And so these themes of identity are derived from that ambiguous picture. And so the apperception test is based on what the person is giving as a narrative, and not what the person is reporting as to what they actually see. So for example, let's say a TAT taker says that one of the two women in the picture that they see is probably a loving, giving person who has been jilted by two insensitive boyfriends. Then the clue here is that there's conflict going on in their own life, which is this organizing theme or pattern. And the thema is an interaction between her need to be spiritually close to others and the environmental press of the men that she's dating who want her to have sex without love. And so that's what the narrative would suggest. In terms of the validity of this test, it's not a valuable tool when it's used alone. And so it's useful when it's tested in conjunction with other means of discovering teams. The narrative approach is the study of motivations through a person's life story or biography. And the story of one's life becomes one's identity. So that's the idea, is that a person's identity and internal inclinations are brought out in a person's narrative or biography. And so this is termed as the narrative approach to personality. And at each stage of life, internal inclinations lead us to seek out and respond to certain situations, which can help further shape our inclinations and our identity. Walter Mischel was an Australian-born American psychologist who studied delayed gratification, and he was the one who developed the marshmallow test. So his work illuminated the ability to delay gratification and to exert self-control in the face of strong situational pressures and emotionally hot temptations. He was born in Vienna in 1930, and he went to graduate school in clinical psychology at Ohio State. He worked with psychologists who took both a cognitive and learning approach to personality, and then he became a professor at Stanford University and was influenced by a lot of the social learning theories of Albert Bandura. What he did was he looked at the size of relations between a person's behavior across situations and their variability. And he claimed that you could not validly predict what a person is going to do based on a previous measure of that person's trait. And so, like, one person could be fearful and anxious when they're in class or they need to speak in front of a group or give a presentation. But another person can have that same reaction, but they don't get nervous when speaking in front of a group, but rather they get nervous when they're on top of a mountain or they're on a roller coaster ride. And so everybody responds in different situations, but they may have, the same anxiety or fear. It's just in different types of situations that they respond to. And so the question was, how well could we predict people's behavior, knowing something about their traits, and how consistent personality-based behavior is across differing situations? Mischel relied on the correlation coefficient to predict people's behavior based on their traits. And so the correlation coefficient is a statistic that tells us how well one variable can predict or is associated with another variable. So with a perfect positive correlation, that would equal a value of 1. So the coefficient would equal 1. So this would mean that if someone is high on extroversion, then they will also behave in a way that's consistent with being extroverted, such as being highly sociable, energetic, or outgoing. Mitchell claimed that most correlations between personality and behavior, or behavior that he measured across situations, rarely exceeded 0.3 to 0.4. And so he concluded that because correlations were closer to 0 than to 1, personality traits really have little to no relationship to shaping behavior. So Mitchell studied delayed gratification. And so he came up with this aspect of self-control that occurs when an individual chooses to forego an immediate reinforcer to wait for a later, better one. And so he wanted to examine individual differences in people in what they choose to do. If they choose to delay gratification or they choose an immediate reinforcer. And so he looked at individual differences in the meanings that people give to stimuli and reinforcements. And he called these personal meanings. They were known as strategies or styles. So he suggested that these personality characteristics or these cognitive strategies are learned during experiences with situations and their rewards. And so he theorized that an individual's behavior, like delay of gratification, is really a result of environmental constraints and internal cognitive characteristics of the individual. So internal cognitive characteristics would be like self-regulatory strategies, and environmental constraints would be experience with the stimulus or with desired objects. Mitchell has discussed 4 personality variables: the person's abilities and knowledge, encoding strategies, which are schemas and mechanisms that a person uses to process information, expectancies, which are outcome expectancies for our behavior, and self-efficacy expectancies. And then lastly, plans. And so his studies demonstrated that personality is not an internal condition that pushes an individual towards behavior regardless of the situation. But it's also not an individual, being at the mercy of environmental events. It's really a matter of both that are going on at the same time. And so things like delayed gratification is really a result of a person's situation and the visibility and experience with that situation and internal characteristics of them as well. Attribution theories in the field of social psychology examine the ways that we draw inferences about other people's behavior. And attribution theories often find that we have biases and make errors when we do judge others. And it typically is because we don't know about the person's situation. And so when we don't know the forces behind their behavior, we often tend to attribute their personal qualities as the cause. For example, a friend may be seen as selfish or fearful because he refuses to donate blood during a blood drive. But the situation at hand might be that he was exposed to a bacteria or exposed to a virus, and so he's not an acceptable donor. So because we don't see those forces and we often don't know them, we tend to over-explain incorrectly in terms of personality, and we overgeneralize. And by overgeneralizing, we underestimate the strength of the situation. So although we sometimes make biased or distorted inferences, despite that, there is good evidence for validity. There's some studies that show that different judges of personality, like parents, friends, and classmates, often tend to judge personality correctly, and they often tend to agree. So they're showing some inter-rater agreement in terms of knowing the target in the same context. However, even if they don't know them in the same situation, it's not necessary for interjudge agreement. And so overall, the findings show that there is cross-situational consistency. One question we need to ask ourselves is, what is trait relevance? How relevant is traits to behavior and the personality of a situation? Well, from what we know now, is personality is a weak predictor of behavior. Overall, the correlation between personality traits and behavior is around 0.3 to 0.4. There is some validity for it, and personality traits do play somewhat of a role in behavior, but it's not explaining all behavior because a lot of it is the power of the situation. And sometimes the power of the situations is very strong and it overrides all of our inclinations. Also, the power of the situation over our actions really depends on the source of our identity in that situation. And certain situations provide the opportunity for certain traits to be expressed. One major problem and limitation among this theory is that it's very complicated to classify a situation because no two situations are ever exactly alike, and the world is constantly changing over time. So, for example, American families now versus families 60 years ago, where if you put them in the same situation, there's going to be differences. Time differences are going to lead to differences in education, entertainment choices, proximity of extended family, and families' relations with other ethnic groups. And so, as similar as situations can be, they can still be different due to the passage of time. Take, for example, different generations of people. A person from Generation Y may act very differently from Generation X, despite being in the same situation and despite having personality traits that are similar. And so this is why it's so important to specify the power of a situation in a given event and interpret and be able to identify how much power and how strong is the situation versus the strength of people's personality constructs. And is this situation bringing out or desirable for certain traits to be expressed? Some issues regarding personality tests is reliability, so whether or not they show internal consistency, and the appropriateness of situations as being associated with personality traits. The big 5 dimensions of personality generally assume that personality traits are the average of several behaviors, and these behaviors are aggregated together. And so they'd assume that the extrovert will appear sociable when various behaviors are considered together. So they're aggregated. It's sort of an average behavior. Personality tests like the big 5 dimensions assume that there are relatively few dimensions of personality and relatively few basic sorts of situations. They don't explain, for example, why an extroverted person may not talk at all at a party or not attend a social event or decide not to take the lead on certain projects because it's based on average behavior. So if there's overall consistency in behavior or an aggregation, that average is assumed to belong to a category of dimensions of personality. So in personality psychology, there's some objective evidence that shows individual behavior can be understood in a social context that is being driven by mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are these brain cells that are reacting and firing in the same way when we see someone else performing an action similarly to us. So there are brain cells that are firing in the same way when somebody acts and sees someone acting in the same way. And so, in other words, it's this system in our brain that's linking our behavior to the behaviors and emotions of other people. And so, because of these individual differences in the brain, there are some people that are more sensitive to others in a given situation, while other people may not react or be as sensitive to that same situation. So, for example, there's individual differences in empathy. They have actually been linked to differential mirror neuron activity. So, as we develop as children, we start to learn to separate the self from others. And so, when we do this, our social self becomes more prominent in certain situations or at certain times. One psychosocial difference that has explained behavior and personality is this field dependence versus field independence. So it has been shown that field dependent people tend to be more reliant on others and respond in line with the demands of a social situation, whereas field independent people tend to be more independent and rely less on others and respond in line with the demands of a situation. And so in that social realm, they tend to act differently, and they may not necessarily conform the same way to social pressures. Shyness, self-consciousness, performance anxiety, and self-monitoring all become relevant to these matters. So there are some people that are very tied to social roles, and so they take on any demands of a social situation. So, for example, some actors seem to have almost no identity of their own, and they even become their own current roles. On the other hand, other people are unable to play social roles, that they find social situations uncomfortable. And so these qualities in social situations can produce a consistency in personality. Personality psychologists agree that the best and most effective way to study personality is through longitudinal studies. So this is where you take a whole group of people and you follow them over time. You measure their behaviors, their reactions, and their growth and change in the real world. And so psychologist Jack Block defines a longitudinal study to have several qualities. They define it as the close, comprehensive, systematic, objective, and sustained studies of individuals over significant portions of their lifespan. And so this simply means following people over significant periods of time, and usually that's over several years. The problem with a study that lasts several years is that it requires a high level of subject compliance. And so during that time, there may be a lot of dropouts. Some people just simply can't do the study anymore, and so they drop out. Then there's some people that choose to do the study, but maybe they can do it a lot later. And so it can be very difficult to conduct this type of research. In addition to that, there can be issues securing research funding for that many years and publishing results. And so the question is how can we really keep track of people as they move around? And what if someone loses interest in participating in the study? And so this is one of the reasons why many personality psychologists do not do longitudinal studies, just simply because it's very difficult. There have been some researchers that are able to study personality changes over time across lifespans, and they refer to this as the life course approach. Such terms emphasize that patterns of behavior change as a function of age, culture, social groups, etc. And it can also change as a function of internal drives, motives, abilities, and traits. And there's a model called the cumulative continuity. This sums up various ways in which personality tends to remain stable, even though it is still possible to change. And so the process of expanding this concept of the life course is by varying how people interpret situations, by eliciting reactions from others, and by seeking out certain situations that are similar. So in terms of studying trait consistency at different ages, over time, it seems that personality generally is most stable for people in their 50s. But because this information is coming from a compilation of various smaller studies rather than this big major study of the same people across their lives, we have to be careful in terms of interpreting these findings. Longitudinal studies show that some traits, such as conscientiousness, are fairly stable and important throughout life. There's also elements of time dimensions of interactionist approaches. So each experience has effects in the context of previous experiences, and we are more affected by certain environments at certain times in our lives. And so, in conclusion, biological factors are more important in the first decades of life, and situational influences gain importance later in life. And so, time dimension really matters in this person versus situation interactionist perspective. The person situation interactionist approaches endeavor to take into account the many ways that our personality is realized or it unfolds or interacts with the situational context. Some people may be less motivated to conform to societal demands and may prefer to be unique. Such people have a less social and a more personal personality. A full and sophisticated understanding of personality should take such motivation and preferences into account. Despite the amount of understanding we do have about the situation having power over our behavior, to some extent, human behavior is still unpredictable. And personality elicits and provokes certain behavior in others. And in some cases, that consistency of response results in part from our own active conscious efforts. Personality can also change slowly over time. And as we seek out more experiences and influence situations, the situations can in turn interact with us and influence us. There are several strengths and weaknesses of the interactionist approach. So some of the advantages are that there's an emphasis of subjective experiences. And so according to interactionists, the approach provides a more nuanced understanding of social behavior. People are not passive recipients of social roles, but they actively shape these through their interactions with other people. And so there is this emphasis on free will. The other advantage is that the approach understands we are different selves in different situations. Behaving one way in one situation does not define us. It does not define our personality because we respond differently due to the power of the situation. One criticism of this approach is that the theory fails to address the larger social structure and the role of power. And so it's useful for explaining how people interpret and create meaning through their everyday interactions, but it neglects the larger power structures that are shaping those experiences. And so therefore, interactionism doesn't take into account the broader social phenomena, and it fails to recognize the role of power and inequality in shaping those social interactions. Other limitations are that it's difficult to classify situations and define them because not every similar situation is exactly the same. In fact, no two situations are ever the same, no matter how similar they are. The other limitation is that the interactionist approach overlooks biological influences. So there's almost too much of an emphasis on the situation and not enough on genetic influences that could be accounting for behavior. And so it's important that when interactionist approach is viewed, that you're taking into account the advantages but also the limitations of this approach.